Sometime around the middle of Series 3 of the EDAs, the Eighth Doctor made a brief reappearance in the main series for a few stories with some other media companions, and then after Series 4 he spent a few full discs with one of the most important horror writers in the history of fiction, Mary Shelley, which was a strange idea that surprisingly works pretty well. Until then, the first 3 stories on the release The Company of Friends, which is 4 half-hour short stories featuring McGann as 8 and a different companion from various corners of vaguely 8-related canon per episode, and they are alright. I wouldn't really call it an essential release, aside from the 8 and Mary Shelley one, which sets up the next 3 McGann releases, which you can download separately. It has some highlights and is a decent listen if you're a fan of either Bernice Summerfield or the 8th Doctor BBC books or comics though. The Bernice one's my least favourite on this one, maybe out of me being fairly unfamiliar with Bigfinish's earliest spin-off and one of the earlier other media-only characters. What I've heard I like, and I do like Bernice, but her full series is on my list at the moment, and has been for a while because Bigfinish's back catalogue is about the size of Greenland at this point, and if they continue at this rate they'll probably need to start building CD warehouses on the moon by 2035. Benny's story I felt introduced a decent idea that it didn't really have that much room to explore. You can go one of 2 ways in short stories, short and sweet and doesn't outstay its welcome, or overly compressed and generally feels rushed. Basically, Bernice is working as a space archaeologist for this insane countess who's sort of absorbed Time Lord mythology via myth, gotten things out of proportion and is now like a fundamentalist TARDIS worshipper. But because the story doesn't have that much room to breathe, a cackling villain wants to fuck up the TARDIS and is under the impression she's freeing it from Time Lord oppression. The Doctor stops her, spoiler warning, and that's pretty much it. Fitz's story is probably my favourite on the disc, and it's more based on me liking the story more than me liking Fitz, who I was most familiar with his character out of all of them, having read a fair few of the 8th Doctor books when I was a teenager, but I never really liked them for Fitz specifically. I mean, all there really is to him is he's a cocksure prick, and the main joke is him thinking that he's a ladies' man, but in reality he isn't. Clearly somebody was desperate to reinvent the fucking wheel that day. Sorry to anyone out there who likes Fitz, but he never really stuck out to me as anything more than a caricature in the books. However, the plot in Fitz's story is a really funny one. It's basically one prolonged joke about a space security agency stealing the Doctor's identity for a series of infomercials for a subscription planet-saving service. I mostly like this one because one of my favourite comedic targets is advertising, because if any profession, that's profession in quotation marks, deserves to be the target for extreme ridicule, it is most assuredly advertising. Fitz's story is really funny and snappy in a Douglas Adams kind of way. It doesn't outstay its welcome, and I was laughing throughout. The third story is the one that people usually dislike, and I do see why, as it's basically Doctor Who done in the style of the Beano. Yeah, this exists. It's unclear how old the companion from a bunch of comics that I haven't read any of, Izzy, is supposed to be. First thing we're told she's university age, then she goes on to start talking enthusiastically about a comic that she bought when she was a kid. Then I look it up and find out she's supposed to be 17. Serious question here. Is it just me who, when I turned 17, started to sneer at everything I liked when I was 10 years old? And just some of the lines that she has and the way she talks in this, she does sound a lot younger than it's implied she is. That said though, the plot in Izzy's story, while ridiculous yes, and feels like it was written for the Beano, it's about a comic series that Izzy was a fan of, and the last issue before the studio went bust was taken off the market, and it contained a twist that she never got to see, and she makes the Doctor go back and find the last copy, and finds out the alien secret behind the publishing house that made the series, and why it got cancelled. Don't know about you, but I'm kinda into that. Izzy's story is brainless and stupid enough not to be called boring, and while kind of jarring and corny as many people have complained, I can say that I liked it. And finally, flipping tones entirely from that last one, the last episode on this disc is Mary Shelley's introductory story, which, you know what it is. The night that Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein, the Doctor shows up on that stormy night and is all Frankenstein-y. It was always going to be that, and while it sounds kind of counterproductive in a how could this story ever surprise you if you kind of know precisely what it's going to be before the idea even gets off the spider diagram kind of way, Mary's story really surprised me. The reason I expected to not so much dislike this one, just be ambivalent towards it, is a trope that I tend to dislike that goes hand in hand with my disdain for writers going, "Look at my classic literature references, aren't I clever?" Is when people take a famous writer and fictionalise an account of their life as though their famous work actually happened to them and that was what inspired it. I just find it to be a very hackneyed approach that's more suited to fanfiction than people trying to be taken seriously in the real world. That being said, I do actually really like Mary's story. It adds enough timey-wimey elements to keep things interesting and not too predictable, and it empathises enough with Shelley so that we understand her as a character, as well as a famous historical figure. It's a really solid 25-minute horror story. Jonathan Morris knows how to do atmosphere really well, and as I made it clear in the past, he's one of my favourite Bigfinish writers, and while given the plan was to see what it would be like if Shelley was an assistant, and this story was pretty much a prerequisite, it managed to do a trope that I'm automatically biased against really well, and it deserves my recognition for that on top of the solid script. Mary's first outing in the TARDIS, the Silver Turk, has come to be regarded as the other famous Cyberman one by Mark Platt, and rightly so in my book. When taking Mary Shelley on board the TARDIS, it seemed like the right idea to retool Doctor Who so it feels more like a traditional horror story, and he's done just that here. This feels very much like the Cybermen done as part of a story that you'd see in the early days of the horror genre's birth period. Basically, the Doctor takes Mary to the Great Viennese Exposition, where this guy is claiming to have invented this bizarre, malformed version of an early Cyberman that performs in theatres. It plays the piano and chess, etc. Basically, think the opening of Nightmare in Silver, except in 19th century Vienna. And the Doctor and Mary investigate because obviously the Doctor doesn't take the claim, "I invented this thing," seriously. I won't go into much more detail, but drawing the parallels between theatrical performance and robots acting out a function, they're almost like grotesque human-sized marionettes, was a genius move by Platt. The Cybermen we see in this one being used as puppets woven from body parts and bits of flesh stolen from bodies around the city, it's just such a nightmarish scenario that just makes your skin crawl. It takes a little while to get going to flesh us out some characters, but just when we start digging into these characters' secrets, there's just this horrid, foreboding atmosphere just dripping out of every inch of this story. It's about robot puppets being woven out of stolen body parts. Why am I speaking so enthusiastically about this? God, do I sound sick in the head sometimes in these. Okay, anyway, the Silver Turk is utterly horrid in every way imaginable, but in a very, very good way. You will not regret buying this one. Next up, we got Witch from the Well, and it's one of those ones that I think's pretty enjoyable. I'm just not over the moon about it, but it's a decent listen. As I expected, they continued with the traditional horror approach. This week we're doing a sort of Hinchcliffian reappropriation of elements of Witchfinder General, crossed with some timey-wimey sci-fi nonsense. Basically, the Doctor and Mary rescue a pair of creepy teenage twins from what appears to be a witch that shows up on a country estate, and the Doctor and the twins end up stuck in the middle of the 17th century witch scare, while Mary is off learning secrets about her past and her future, and the alien explanation behind the witch. While yes, that all sounds fairly standard and predictable, and it doesn't start too strongly, there's a touch of New Who's way too fast, not enough time for atmosphere and tension to part 1, but as we get into its second part, it starts working in an interesting way as we separate Mary and the Doctor and intercut between them both working on resolving the same plot at 2 different periods in time with 2 different sets of characters. Kind of in a similar way to how The Girl Who Never Was cut between the Doctor and Charlie. So if you like that sort of narrative technique, I would recommend this one. Given Mary was fairly new at this point, it could have been a risky decision, but Julie Cox really sells it. And Paul McGann's really fun in this one, as are the kids playing the really fucking creepy twins. While I wouldn't call it one of Bigfinish's most notable releases, and it probably suffered more from coming directly off the back of the Silver Turk, which was a very hard act to follow, but this one's pretty good for what it is. The brief Mary Shelley run finishes up with Army of Death, and I kind of feel a bit put out by it. But I don't want to be too unkind to it because it features lots of people that I like, and saying this concept out loud, it sounds totally awesome. We're on an alien world somewhere with a stupid name where 2 cities were fighting a war to the death many years ago when one was suddenly annihilated by a massive explosion and the dead citizens are now coming back to life and marching on the other one. And Mary and the Doctor journey into the dead city to look for who's controlling the zombie army. Ages ago back when I started these things, you may remember me calling Minuet in Hell basically Doctor Who done in the style of The Evil Dead. This one's set up to be Doctor Who done in the style of Army of Darkness, and while that is pretty much everything you could ask for if you're into Doctor Who and the kind of cheesy 80s horror movies that I was obsessed with when I was a teenager, and Army of Death does have its moments where it really shines, but lots of it just ended up being a bit of a stuffy political drama mixed up with some vague elements of cheesy sci-fi B-movies. As is, it was just one of those stories where I felt like I'd already heard what it was trying to do quite a few times already. And thus we end the Mary Shelley trilogy. A pretty interesting little cul-de-sac for the 8th Doctor. Not exactly what I'd call essential, but fun while it lasted. I feel that its strength is that it knows it's a small self-contained experiment, so it focuses more on making full usage of the individual concepts that it's got to work with, rather than reaching too far out of its depth. And as said, I particularly recommend Silver Turk. Anyway, the next Bigfinish video will probably come around the end of the month, and will include pretty much everything else on Bigfinish that 8 is featured in, including the 8th Doctor short trips, and since he's also part of Light at the End, I thought I'd chuck that into the next one as well, before we get into the massive epic space opera, Dark Eyes. See? I do provide clarity sometimes. This is me being helpful.